Excuse me if occasionally I have to look down at my notes, because I do want to make sure that I have explained the symbolism of this man's work to the utmost clarity.
1, 2, 3,
4. Okay, it's the 17th of November, 1978. My name is Bill J, and I'm talking to you from Tempe, Arizona. I went to a very disciplined grammar school, as it was called at the time. But the school was run on very harsh disciplinarian lines, and the masters were experts at sadism. And so I remember at the final year that I had at the school, there was an assembly of the students, and the headmaster reeled off the names of the boys who had been accepted for university, and his remarks went something like this. Bob Lee has won a scholarship to Guy's Hospital. He wants to be a surgeon. And all the boys in the audience, of course, applauded and thought that was wonderful. Next name, Rennie Lister has won a scholarship to Nottingham University and wants to be a dentist. Round of applause for Rennie. Peter Appleton is going to a Bible school. He's going to be a missionary in Nigeria. Applause for Peter Appleton. Then he came to Bill J. Bill J says that he doesn't want to go to university. He's interested in photography. And then there was absolute silence amongst the audience. And then everybody burst out laughing. So at that moment, I could have cheerfully slit the throats of every bastard in that room. I was so angry that I vowed there and then that I was going to be better at my field than any of the other students in whatever field that they'd chosen.
The reason I accepted your offer to be included here was because I hold the guy in such high regard.
He was a beacon of hope, really.
He was an evangelist.
Bill was a catalyst for all of us.
I personally think he's the most interesting writer there's been on photography.
He was a lone voice in America, and it's a big bloody country.
He was the flame that started it all.
I would look for photographs in places like the Sunday Times magazine, or perhaps that wasn't even going then, but journals, you know, that would publish occasionally photographs in a more dignified way than the newspapers. And when I saw a bunch of photographs which I didn't understand, then I would contact the photographer, and I would say, I don't understand your photographs, will you please talk to me about them? And invariably they said yes. Well, this went on for the next 4 or 5 years, and my education really began and finished with that personal contact with photographers talking about their own work in a one-to-one situation. And one of the most important photographers at that stage for me was David Hearn, the Magnum photographer. I'd seen some of his prints, didn't understand what he was doing, and asked him if I could talk to him. And he's so articulate that little lights started flashing in the back of my head, said, yes, yes, I've got to get into this. I know what he means.
And my memory is that it was just a ring at the door, you know, and suddenly there was this guy who came and said, you know, I'm working for, actually at that time it was even pre-Creative Camera, it was some technical magazine or something. And he wanted to do two things. One was to interview me, and one was to show me some pictures. And I was more interested in seeing the pictures than being interviewed. And I remember looking at the pictures and thinking they were incredibly boring and repetitious. But then he started to talk about photography. And he said he was really a writer, you know, as well. And he just seemed interested in the kind of conversation about photography that I was interested in participating in.
Okay, so this is a postcard that our dad sent to his grandmother where he expressed his first interest in photography.
The postcard says, Dear Nan, thanks a lot for your letter. This morning we went to Lymington and bought some fishing tackle for trout. A chap in our tent is keen on photography, so when I come home I'm going to start printing my own negatives. Tomorrow 3 of us, including Mick, are going to a carnival all day. Don't worry if you get a lot of cards, as they are the only things you can spend money on. Cheerio for now. Love, Billy.
One magazine that I was writing for as a little bit of extra income was a magazine called Camera Owner. It was sold through the little packets that people got their snapshots back, you know, from the photo dealer. So I went to see the owner of it and said, I hear you're going to close the magazine. Why don't you give it to me? While I was talking to the owner of this magazine, a man came in that I'd never met before, and his name was Colin Osman. His income came from a family business which was publishing a magazine for racing pigeon enthusiasts. So Colin said, well, I would like to, you know, publish a magazine in photography. I'm very interested in photography, but I wouldn't want to edit it. But I've got the publishing set up. So I said, why don't we become partners, you know? You do the publishing and I'll do the editing. And so on a handshake, and that was it. We did it. I got 51% of the business and he got 49%.
I first met Bill at Creative Camera. I came into the room and I looked the guy up and down and said, this is an interesting character. I thought Robin Hood was dead. We chatted for a bit about this, that, and the other. And in the midst of the conversation, I sat and said, look, I have to ask you, what's your background? I mean, where were you before here? He says, well, not that long ago, I was selling Bibles door to door.
So it was a very gradual transition over about a year. In fact, you can get Camera Owner and Creative Camera and see that gradual sort of transition. We were trying to build up a new readership. And that was, don't forget, this was in England in 1967, somewhere around there. Nothing was happening photographically.
Bill was a sort of a Pied Piper figure, really. He was shining a light onto a whole area of photography that we simply didn't know about in Britain. And what I really loved was the American street photographers he published. He published lots of other stuff, but I really loved, you know, Gary Negrad, Lee Freelander, Burkhazor, Cartier-Bresson, and Robert Frank.
I don't think I ever missed a copy. I bought it every month, and it was something that I looked forward to looking at, because it seemed to have a little bit more zap creativity, a bit more images to my liking in it than the normal amateur photographers or photography or whatever, you know.
I saw Creative Camera when I was at Surbiton Grammar School. My craft teacher took it. And that was one of the things that consolidated my opinion that photography was the right thing for me to study. So here I was introduced to the likes of Winogrand and Robert Frank.
Well, it was the magazine that, I always wanted to read in preference to any other photographic magazine. There were one or two other reasonable photographic magazines that were around at that time, Swiss Camera magazine and occasionally Photography magazine. Had some interesting work in and some interesting articles, but Creative Camera was very different. It exposed me to, photographers I wouldn't have seen in the other magazines, like Diane Arbus and Lee Friedlander, Gary Winogrand, and some English photographers probably that I wouldn't have seen before.
I remember there's Alan Ballard, who's a name much forgotten now, I think probably completely forgotten, but I was always very interested that he's a stills photographer, shot on film sets, but he had a feature in creative camera. And I took that to be showing people like me that you could be creative and do your own thing while on a film set or with a magazine. You didn't just have to do it the way they expected it to be done.
Hearn's flat in London was regarded as like quite a social club, where photographers who were visiting, coming through, then the people in Magnum would accumulate there as well. And Bill was very much part of that sort of whole system, if you like, because Bill and David were big mates.
A group of photographers, maybe 20, 30, 40 sometimes, a big crowd, would all sit on the floor in David Hearn's flat. The photographer would talk about his work and show photographs. There'd be a projector and all of that kind of thing.
Meanwhile, of course, I was going bankrupt. I mean, there's no way I could support myself. We had no income. And so I started selling my shares back to Colin Osman, and ended up with nothing.
Well, I've never met a person who was less interested in money, to the point where he almost starved himself at certain times. He would earn money and, he used to go around all over the bloody country giving lectures to camera clubs and things, for nothing almost, limited amounts of money, etc.
I mean, he was like an evangelical preacher, going to these places, looking for people to convert. I'm not sure how successful he was in the camera club world, but nonetheless, he was determined to find anyone who would actually entertain him and host him, and he would start, preaching, if you like. And I think, obviously, some of these things fell on deaf ears, but a lot of it really took off.
When Billy Graham was over in England, he went up to see Billy Graham, and I think he went a couple of times, actually. And I think when Billy Graham sort of used to call people down, I think he went. So I think that probably was quite a big influence at the time.
Also, I realized that a lot of amateur photographers were interested in photographing girls without their clothes on, but they couldn't get hold of the models. Well, there were some clubs in London that were basement clubs that were called rent-a-nude clubs, where you could go in, rent a camera, rent a model. So I rented one of these places for every Saturday morning. And then I would advertise in the magazine. So I made my income on a Saturday morning to keep the magazine going. So I didn't have to take any money from the magazine.
I think it's no secret that myself and a few other people virtually kept him alive at some time, which you had to do in a polite manner. And so you just invited him to dinner a lot, basically.
And one of the first people who came in to see me was a young red-headed guy with a droopy Fu Manchu moustache and with a Kodak yellow box under his arm. And he stood in front of my desk and glowered at me and said, "Your magazine's shit." So, of course, I was a bit irate. So I said, "What do you mean by that?" He said, "Well, it's crap magazine," he said, "but I can see you're trying to learn. I can see you're on the right track, so I've come here to help." And I thought, you arrogant sod, who the hell do you think you are, just walking in off the street and telling me, what I should be doing? So I said, well, you better put your cards on the table. Yes. I mean, what right do you have to talk to me like that? He said, "I thought you'd ask that, so I brought you my prints to look at." So I opened his yellow box, feeling very prickly and antagonistic, and went through the prints, and within 10 minutes, I was absolutely sold. And I said, "You're right, you've got a great deal to teach me. What do I do?" He said, "Well, my name's Tony Ray Jones, and the first thing that we're going to do is go to America together."
He thought that it was an interesting opportunity to express a new vision of British photography. So he went round to see Bill, and I think he said, and this has been printed, that your magazine could do so much better because you're printing shit and you could like really embrace the revolutions that are happening in photography, not only in the United States, but the potential for that in England.
So I said, I can't do that. I mean, I don't have any money. I mean, wasn't drawing a salary from the magazine at that point. I was earning my living talking to camera clubs for $14 a night. I didn't have any money to go. He said, well, how committed are you? You just told me you wanted to learn about photography. If you're committed, you'll go. So I saw what possessions I had. We got a charter flight to New York, and he introduced me to a lot of photographers in New York City, including Gene Smith and Schakowsky and Arbus and Friedlander and Winogrand and Merovich and Frank, and we did the lot. Right, we did the lot.
I think it benefited Bill's vision a lot. It really expanded his vision about what the publication could be, what his vision of photography could be. And I think that Bill was very nourished by that, and it seeded his vision of the future.
1968, this was the first time I saw the photographs of Tony Ray Jones, America and England. And I think Tony influenced me a little bit, not so much in the subject matter, but I, up to that point, hadn't really realised that you could do your own thing and be English. It was something that Americans could do, but in England you couldn't do it. And when I saw these Tony Ray Jones pictures for the first time, I thought, well, maybe this is something English people can do as well.
The influence of Creative Camera was obviously not surprising because the competition was embarrassingly poor. The British were introduced on a regular basis to film test and new camera equipment and the technical aspects of photography and pretty sunsets and birds in the sky and girls on the beach. They weren't seeing people using photography in a focused contemporary manner to say something.
Well, one of the things you have to realize is that people who are working with photography as artists, Harry Callahan, Eugene Atche, Ernest Cole, Edward Wesson, Siskin, Cartier-Bresson, Elliot Erwitt, Lucien Claire, Fox Talbot, Horst. You see, it was hard getting really good photographs, serious photographs published with any kind of integrity and having them seen by the preferred audience, like-minded souls. And Bill provided that. And so this Callahan spread is just amazing. So when he was active in Creative Camera, he had a very large voice in a very small community, but it was pivotal, it was seminal, it was essential to so many of us.
It was the only show in town, really, for anything that you could call contemporary photography, that was pushing the barriers, whether it be a personal documentary project or very much a fine art project.
And I produced a book, a dummy of a book called The Somnambulist, which came out in 1970, about the time Bill was publishing. And of course, he ran spreads from all my books, Somnambulist, Deja Vu, and Days at Sea, as I was working on them.
When I got back to Creative Camera, things were a lot more settled. The magazine was gaining more subscribers, and I was having more and more problems with Colin Osman as a publisher because I wanted to even extend, beyond, where he wanted to stop. I wanted to get even more involved in this area of photography. And so this came to a real sticky situation. And so in the end, Colin Osman said, you're fired. I'm going to edit the magazine. I don't want you to edit anymore. So I was absolutely crushed because I'd built this magazine up and it was a labor of love. I'd taken no money from it. I was doing it in the evenings while rushing around the country talking to camera clubs. And this was my baby. My whole life was in it. I mean, literally. And so I was absolutely defeated.
it's a difficult thing to say, because obviously the people that edited the magazine from then on obviously defend their particular thing in the magazine. For me, when he left, you could see the curve of interest went down and down and down the more theoretical it became. I think it's right in saying that its potential audience went down in that sort of way. I mean, Bill was very down to earth. He either showed pictures or talked about a real alternative history of photography.
I thought, right, another magazine is all it needed now that's very different, the way that Creative Camera should be. I'll be able to produce it totally on my own. I happened to meet a BBC producer whose name was Tristram Powell, the son of Anthony Powell, the novelist. And he had a bit of money. He was willing to put that money aside in a little account. It was £4,000.
Bill came in high spirits. He had just taken over some offices in Princedale Road, which is 10 minutes in the car from David's flat. At that particular time, they were upstairs, and I remember it very clearly. It was an upstairs room, and it was completely bare, nothing in there. There was one packing case, and that was it.
He was a very creative editor, and enthusiasm carried him a long way. And of course, the deal was for photographers, well, we're going to publish your photographs in this beautiful magazine, and they will be lovingly produced to as high a standard as we can make it, but we're not paying you.
With an incredible optimism, I thought that this is exactly what the European photographers have been waiting for, to funnel in from America and from everywhere else the very best work from right across the photographic spectrum. And this will open the European photographers' eyes, to the possibilities of the medium.
I really remember quite vividly Bill showing me the work of Eugene Smith and the prints and telling me, his meeting with Eugene Smith in New York, and the fact that Eugene Smith had no money, and Bill went and bought him a pair of shoes because he could see there were holes in his shoes, and then as a result of that meeting, Eugene Smith sent him some prints.
And so he was trying to kind of tell people that there was this wonderful tradition of documentary photography, which was something that we just simply didn't know about in Britain at all.
I should mention, meanwhile, of course, I was very active in many other areas, not just the magazine, talking to young photographers, visiting art schools, colleges, universities. Reading voraciously and collecting imagery in slide form to show to other people.
The nature of it at that time was that it was very, very London-based. Therefore, people that were outside of London, by and large, had not heard of these people. One of the things that Bill J did, because he was going out and talking, and it happened that Manchester had a few young people, Daniel Meadows, Brian Griffin, Martin Parr, were all happened to be at Manchester. When Bill went up there and talked to them, Bill would talk to them about these photographers that they'd never heard of. So in their mind, it seems to me reasonable, they thought they'd discovered them.
The autumn of 1971, we were invited to a guest lecture by this man called Bill J, who I knew nothing about at all.
In comes Bill, Robin Hood straight away, sits down. I remember him having like a hunting jacket on. Was he? Look, my imagination might be going wild here, but I think it was green. It was slightly flared from the waist, I think. It had like a brown leather around the back of the shoulders and that, on the back here somewhere. And he had boots that were essentially black with brown leather circular toppings to them. And his trousers were tucked into the boots.
My first real memorable encounters when he came to Manchester Polytechnic on his sort of grand tour of the UK delivering his lecture about contemporary photography, and in particular, I remember the impact of seeing Tonio Jones' work for the first time.
He's like a preacher. He was very enthusiastic. It was as though he'd slept with his toes plugged into the 13-amp socket, and he was alive and on fire.
And I seem to remember that Martin and I were quite near the front. Maybe Daniel was with us as well. We weren't like stuck down the back a bit. We were right down the front. So maybe we knew about Bill J, Martin and I.
And he had a carousel projector and a cable snaking from it. And he sat in the front of the room. And he had these they were like the tablets of stone, the yellow carousel boxes. And inside these were slide collections of the photographers that he wanted to enthuse about. And boy, did he enthuse,
I think the first thing about Bill and his lecture is he was just passionate, enthusiastic, and incredibly knowledgeable. We were at Manchester Polytechnic where, basically they were teaching us to be commercial photographers. And although there would be reference to the likes of Bill Brandt, they hadn't really any notion of what contemporary practice was about. So here, this guy bursts into the room, starts talking about this, starts showing people like Tonio Jones and the other British photographers. And boy, we were hit like a tornado. We hadn't seen this sort of enthusiasm and this quality of work. So it was absolutely a key event.
I sat there and I watched this work being projected, and it was magical, really. Because we got a lot from our tutors, but we didn't get an understanding of what contemporary photography practice was about.
I think we would all cite Bill's influx and input into that lecture as being absolutely pivotal.
He was very enthusiastic that we should not sit around and wait to be told what to do. If you sit around and wait to be told what to do, you'll never make pictures and you'll never make a career. So what you have to do is to decide on your subject matter. He was big on subject matter. What are you going to photograph? How are you going to photograph it?
We thought we were very rich with £4,000, which was about $8,000 at that time, and we thought that'll be no problem at all. So we had the best paper, the nicest printing we could find, for the money, and we started just portfolios, no equipment reviews, no small ads, just nice publication.
So these are my copies of album. I've got all 12 copies of album. This is the first album, slightly battered, and I was never published an album, but what he says here in his first editorial is, what about the upcoming youngsters? He's slanging off in this editorial, Bill's having words in his editorial about the state of British photography, and how it's basically sort of been neglected by the powers that be within the art establishment and photographic community.
Meanwhile, I was active in several other areas. I'd begun a photographic study centre at the Institute of Contemporary Arts. But again, I had constant daily battles with the art establishment, locking me out of meetings, didn't like the idea that photography was so popular.
It doesn't take long for someone to really ignite the flame and for other people to get excited and share the passion that he had, and for other people to take it up. And you can meet and see, myself included, many photographers from that era who, benefited from that real insight that he had, the ability to take what he learned from America and to apply it to the UK. And of course, he was part, as well as Sue Davis, of setting up first the ICA and then secondly the Photographers Gallery.
I first met Bill J when we were doing the Spectrum exhibition at the ICA, probably early 70s or late 69. And he had very fierce ideas about what he wanted to do. I think he talked to Mike Cousteau and they started the study centre.
The first time I heard about the ICA, when Bill asked me to come along and to the opening, and so I did, and I went along to the opening, and he had gotten people like Peter Sellers to give slide projectors and stuff like that, and he opened it, I think, with a show on Romano Cagnoni, who was an Italian sort of paparazzi figure that worked in Africa a lot.
Bill had this way of bringing people together. I must have just turned up at the Photo Study Centre. He was probably running about and being busy doing 30 different things. Pointed me towards the carousels that interested me, and I was then loading them into a projector and looking at the work. And then he probably said, loudly across the room, "Oh, and Paul Strand's talking at the whatever, the Royal Photographic Society," or I think it was the Royal Photographic. And I went, "Wow, I'm gonna hear Paul Strand speak." It's like I've met the evangelist, and now I'm going to meet God.
They used to have some Kodak carousel slides which they used to project. I think you used to have going booths where if you wanted to look up a photographer, you could do it. I mean, it's a very good idea, I mean, that's pioneering. I mean, no one was doing anything like that at that particular time.
His instinct was that it was the best thing to do. I mean, a lot of things had been done in London when he was there, and always like pulling teeth. I mean, I had done a lot of work with him on setting up exhibitions and programs and things that we tried to do together, and we tried to do a series of programs with lectures at the ICA and with the RPS, and we did all these things, but it really was like pulling teeth. And I mean, the RPS, we had so many people who used to come to the lectures we organised there that they couldn't get in.
He married our mother at the age of 21, and then, 2 kids in 2 more years. And so all the meanwhile, he was working on album, and he was gone. He was commuting from a little village on the Thames to London every day. And so he would be gone by the time we got up in the morning, and he would come back after we had gone to bed. And it was very difficult because, our mother didn't speak English very well, and they didn't have any money.
I think he had some kind of thing in his mind that somehow, if he was in with Tristram and Aidan Ellis, I think it was, that somehow he would have more to say. It would be his magazine. And the reality is that when it came, I learned later that in the contract, he wasn't even part of the setup. He was the dog's body, basically. Now, he was the dog's body that got on and did it, but it wasn't his magazine.
And I used to go in the evenings once a month and put magazines in envelopes, and I tried to sell subscriptions to the magazine at college. And then, of course, the magazine folded.
Well, it closed for several reasons. Some of them I mean, and other people will tell you this. He refused to have any advertising in the magazine, right? And that was a kiss of death, because you need advertising in order to get these people together. You have to give something in order to get something. And he wasn't really willing to bend or flex. He was a purist.
Album closed because it was, from a business point of view, was run very badly.
The printers had generously given us 3 months credit, so we were paying 3 months in arrears. And they knew our state of our bank account. In fact, they handled it. So, we weren't cheating on them. But suddenly they said, "I'm sorry, but we've got to take 3 months printing bills." Our head office has said, "We've got to tighten up." So they took 3 months print bills away from us, which killed us, stone dead. And in another 3 months, we would have made it.
We all paid our money up for the first lot of album, then we all paid our money up for the second lot of album, and there were any albums. There just weren't any. And he couldn't pay the printer, as far as I could see, talking to David Hearn. He owed the printer a lot. He never sent the pictures back to the photographers, so some of them were pretty cross.
I done some work for Time Life Books, and the woman there called Margot Hapgood called me up and said, I hear that there's a place out in the country that is selling a lot of postcards, photographic postcards. Are you interested? So I said, yeah, fine. So we went to this sort of Gothic Victorian mansion and walked into the front door, and there in a big empty room was a guy tearing up postcards and putting them in a sack. And I walked in the other room, and floor-to-ceiling shelves, boxes of albumen prints, thousands upon thousands of them. No one had any idea that this archive existed of 19th century, British views.
I remember this sort of box carton of prints, which was in David Hearn's flat. And he said, well, which ones would you like? So I went into this carton and just, picked about 20 prints, because there were hundreds,
I bought as many of the albumen prints as I could, just so at least something would be saved. And then I called the museums in America and said, do you want albumen prints by Francis Frith? I can get you as many as you want for $1 each. For $1 each. And so George Eastman House, Museum Modern Art, and all these people were buying them from me for $1 each, and I was making a good profit. This is how I was supporting myself, by selling albumen prints for $1. I had now had £4,000 in the bank. I was rich.
And that's what I was trying to do with the art establishment in England, waking them up to photography. And although that's very energizing to fight every minute of every day of your life, it's also very exhausting. Oh, yes. So with Creative Camera being taken from me, with album folding, with the Institute of Contemporary Arts being a constant battle with the art establishment, I was getting a bit punch drunk by this time. And Van der Koch had come to England on one of his annual trips, and we were sitting in a little pub garden, quaffing our ale. And he said, well, why don't you just take a year off and come to the University of New Mexico, recharge your batteries, learn what's going on over here, and then you can go back with batteries recharged, and fight again. So I said, you get me in and I'll come. Well, I didn't think anything more of it. It's just one of those conversations that seemed to pass by. And a couple of months later, I got a note from him saying, well, if you're coming, come. And so I sold up everything. I sold everything that I owned and got on a plane at Gatwick Airport outside London.
And went back to college.
And went back to school as a student. And it was an incredibly liberating time.
Van der Koch and Beaumont Newell had, in their own way, seen the magazine and knew Bill. And they persuaded him to come over to Albuquerque to come on to a course which was designed for people that wanted to go into teaching or gallery management, etc., etc., etc. In my opinion, undoubtedly the best course of its time there's ever been. I mean, you only have to look at, it's like a who's who of American photographers came out of that course, and they brought over Bill against every rule of American universities.
So I think he had various reasons for leaving. He owed a lot of money, and he just got out of everything. He escaped.
When our father was given an opportunity to come to the University of New Mexico to study photography, he had watched a movie with Marilyn Monroe where she traveled on a Greyhound bus, and he thought it looked like a really great way to see the country. And so what we did is instead of traveling directly from England to New Mexico, which was our final destination, we flew to California and took a Greyhound bus from California to New Mexico, never realizing the extent of the journey You know, America is such a large country, and of course in England, looking at the map, everything is so much smaller. We had no idea what a journey that was going to be. And at one point, the bus would stop at a Greasy Spoon at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we would get off the bus in the dark, and just this wave of heat would just hit us. We were so unused to that. We thought maybe it was the engine of the bus or something. I remember our dad turning around and talking to the bus driver and saying, "Can you tell me where we are?" And he said, "You're in Phoenix, Arizona." And our dad said, "Good, because I'm never coming here again."
So we arrived in Albuquerque in August of 1972, and it was definitely culture shock. It was beautiful, high and dry, bright blue skies, and hot and sunny. And it was just wonderful. And there were so many people, I think, that he just was in his element. There was Beaumont Newhall, Vander and Koch, all of these amazing photographers at that place at that time. And I think it was just wonderful for him. He just loved it and flourished.
And then I got to the university, and Van showed me their photographs in the art museum, hanging on the walls, and no one's complaining. In England, you know, we were fighting tooth and nail on a daily basis to get photographs, you know, on the walls of museums and galleries. In fact, we opened the first photographic gallery in the whole of Britain, called Do Not Bend Gallery. So the idea, you know, and then there were lectures on photography, and photographers would be paid to come and talk to the students, you know, whatever.
I first met Bill in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, and I was entering the MFA photo program run by Vander and Koch and Beaumont Newhall, and he was there already as a student.
And then the first day that Van said, "I think this is your first semester, you should only take 9 hours, you know." So I said, "Okay, Van, you know, well, you just tell me what to do and I'll do it." And he gave me, you know, these 3 classes of 3 hours each, and I wrote those down. And then I said, "Then what do I do on Tuesday?" And he said, "What do you mean, what do you do on Tuesday?" So I said, "Well, here's the 9 hours for Monday." He said, "No, 9 hours for the week." I said, "Well, what do I do the rest of the time?" I mean, I was used to working 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the idea that I was only going to be in class for 9 hours a week, I mean, was absolutely ludicrous. So I felt, being at university in New Mexico with Beaumont and Van, that I'd been like a frontline fighter that's suddenly been told the war is over, you can go home.
Our parents loved it. This was before Hannah was born. We were, 8 and 9 when we moved over, and they were just every weekend just going to discover the pueblos in and around Taos, Santa Fe, riding horses, bought land, like while we were on a temporary visa,
Right.
and just loved it.
Built a cabin in New Mexico with no electricity, miles and miles and miles away from the nearest little store that didn't even sell toilet paper. But he built an A-frame, and he had a lot of friends, Jim Hychek and a lot of other students that he knew in New Mexico came up and did a roof raising.
And so he had traded some photographs he had, some 19th century photographs, for land. And then he had scraped together stuff to start building this cabin. And I had a pickup truck, and we would go up there loading the pickup truck with materials and stuff and kind of help work on building this very simple A-frame cabin up in the woods.
In England, he was sort of a cross between Friar Tuck and Robin Hood, right? In America, he was trying to go Western. You know, he was more interested in a different image of himself. He was trying to, you know, cowboy his image a bit. You know what I mean? He wanted to take on all the American expectations. You know.
Our parents said that we were going to a naturalist club, and we didn't really like that idea.
And we said, "Can we bring our Easter baskets?"
And so we went.
With our Easter baskets.
And I sat in the car the whole day. I was just horrified.
There was naked people everywhere.
It was terrible. It was awful.
But then, after a period of time, the lease was up on the house that they were renting in New Mexico, and they didn't have another place to span the gap. So we ended up being sort of the caretakers of the naturalist camp.
So we lived there for like a summer.
And our father was he was in charge of the photography and making the calendars.
He did the calendar.
He was very knowledgeable about the history of photography, and I was very interested in processes. And we would talk a lot about things that he had discovered because he had begun his filing system. He had made a promise to himself that he would read everything that was published in the 19th century that mentioned photography.
Van was the hard no. I mean, he kicked butt. I mean, so it was a good cop, bad cop routine. You felt sort of, you didn't know what was going on, or you're upset or something. You went over to Beaumont's house, and he fed you, and, I mean, there was always a sort of guy to talk to. Van, hell, I mean, we had these semester reviews, which were Inquisition time. This was all the graduates together in a room, and all the faculty. And they would tell you exactly how you stood in relationship to the program, I mean, this was not, how do you feel about these photographs, or, what is the... No, I mean, this was professional. I mean, this is how you're doing, this is how you're not doing, And Van would say in conclusion, you might as well get out of this university because you're never getting a degree as long as I'm here.
Van Deren Koch grilled Bill as part of these final oral exams that are in front of the rest of the photo faculty until Bill couldn't answer a question. And then the exam was over. Van finally felt superior in a way to Bill's knowledge, and then he felt he was worthy of getting an MFA.
There we go. Okay, so here's a Bill J. This would have been the first look of him at Arizona State. And this is Bill with his special class of his best students.
When Bill arrived at the department in '74, there had already been a strong photo history program over the years. In fact, Van Deren Koch taught there. So the photo history department was a focus, and we were informed. I was still down the hall in ceramics at that point and started taking classes from Bill the next year. But the photo history dialogue was going on. We knew who Bill was. We knew he was coming. We knew he was coming from working with Beaumont and Van, and we knew that he had brought American photography to England.
He came out of whatever you call it, university or something, whatever Albuquerque was, and suddenly a job was up for grabs. And my guess is that Van Deren Koch said, this is an exceptional person, you should do it. And he went, so I think that's the only reason he went to, there was no other choice than the job was available, and he took it.
I first knew him holding court in our local coffee shop right at the edge of campus. So every morning Bill would be there at 7 o'clock, coffee, cigarettes, and the students would start to gather because they knew that he was there. And before we went to class at 9, half of our grad group at least was there, even though it was really early in the morning. But you never missed time with Bill. There was always a new story that would be exciting. Or we could tell him what we were interested in, or what we read, or a photograph we saw, and he could wind it through and tell us where the roots of that was. It was amazing.
You've got to remember that world of photography is run by curators and theoreticians, academics even, who didn't really believe in photography in the way that he does. That was the key thing. He got photography like photographers get photography.
was absolutely loved by every student that ever took his class. His office was the place that students came on campus and they'd stop in and have a cup of coffee. That there was this unbelievably gross, never cleaned, what is it called, Mr. Coffee machine that ended up with about 3/4 of an inch of guck all over it, that he would make maybe 8 to 10 pots of coffee a day. And students would just come in, have a cigarette with him, and drink coffee, and that would kind of start their day. His lectures became larger and larger and larger and larger. He was very, very loved by the students.
Without question, Bill's reach and his reputation as a speaker went far beyond the photography department. Students in other departments would come and sit in the back of this giant hall that Bill lectured in called Neeb Hall. His lectures were completely fascinating and not at all simply about photography. It was really about the world, about creativity.
It's a very difficult concept, which I tell my students rightly or wrongly. In fact, I argue with my fellow faculty members about this issue. I will go to a graduate seminar and insist that whatever they're working on, that they do with intense concentration, utter commitment, as if it was the most important thing in their lives and so on. But at the same time, they should be able to step back and say, yes, but in the cosmic scheme of things, it's not very important.
As much as he knew, even before any lecture, he would be in his office, he'd be going over his notes, he would be preparing. I remember David Hearn, who came over a lot, would one time I said, well, why are you know all this? Why are you spending all this time getting ready for a lecture? And he just wanted to be the best that he possibly could. I think he really did love the student contact. I think he loved getting people to share that passion that he had.
When I went to teach at Newport, Bill Jay would visit sometimes, and I remember the lectures that he gave to the students. Always in the summer, he'd pop over and then, oh, Bill's here today, and Bill would sit down and talk about some interesting aspect of photographic history, spirit photography, for instance.
Well, he liked Colin Wilson, and Colin Wilson liked all that sort of mystic stuff, etc. And build it. And this is the book, The Mind Machine. I've forgotten all about it. Photography and Psychic Phenomena. It's a pretty big book, which I suspect this is the only copy in the world of it. It was certainly never published.
Bill Jay was the most interesting lecturer on the history of art, because he really spoke about photography in the context of art, science, invention. He explained why the sciences were ripe, really, for photography to be invented in two places at the same time, virtually. We learned what was happening not just in photography trends, but in artistic trends, in literature, in dance, in music. Everything was culturally tied together.
And I then suddenly woke up and thought, what the hell am I doing? That after all that very high energy work in England, constant fighting and involvement, now I'm playing dull academic games, writing papers and producing articles and involved in university politics, but it all adds up to very little. So then it started me thinking, well, but I don't seem to be that unusual to other people that I know in the photographic world here. So do they take this for granted? I mean, is this what they expect out of life? So I started talking to them on these subjects and found that there was very little response. They thought, yeah, this is really what it's all about. And so then I started exploring areas like third force psychologists and philosophers and quantum physicists and parapsychologists, you know, and exploring what else is going on that seems to me very dynamic areas, you know, constant energy and involvement.
And when you're teaching, you have to have, you are a human being talking to other human beings. And I always felt that Bill was very much a human, you know, a people person. And he, you know, and his enthusiasm and his body language or whatever it may be, his language or whatever, was appropriate to human interaction. And it had that narrative quality which was engaging, and everyone could relate to it, you know, rather than just 2 or 3 people in the audience who understood what was going on.
Bill was a performer, really, in his lectures. And his lectures were rich with illustration, so you're consistently engaged with surprising image after surprising image. And he would kind of cushion the masterworks that we had read in the Beaumont Newhall history, et cetera, with what else was going on at the time and the experimentation that was going on at the time and the path of history. We really came through his history classes understanding not just who came before us as art makers, but also who were the people that built our history, that did the research. And, you know, Helmut Gernsheim finding the Julia Margaret Cameron work, and then to have Helmut Gernsheim come and spend a semester with us was extraordinary. So he had a dialogue with us, but he clearly had a dialogue with the community at large, and so many people came through to spend time with us. We would be sitting at the feet of masters. Every weekend there'd be barbecues, there'd be gatherings in Bill's backyards, and just an amazing community that was built around Bill J.
He also had this extraordinary ability in his writing and in his lecturing that you felt at the end of a lecture you wanted to go out and shoot pictures. That's what I want from an exhibition, or from a bit of writing, or from a lecture.
We have a particular emotional immaturity in our culture today. And that immaturity says that if you don't like my opinion, you cannot like me. It seems to me that a mark of emotional and intellectual maturity is that you can fight with someone's opinion and love them as human, you know? I don't have any problem with saying to somebody at a faculty meeting, that idea stinks, all right? And then go and have a cup of coffee with them after that. I mean, I don't find that a problem. But that colleague certainly does, and if I ask him for a cup of coffee, I would say, get out of here, you hate my guts, don't you, obviously. Yeah? That, it seems to me, is one of the big problems we've got in photographic criticism.
Bill's relationship with academia was problematic, I think. Although he loved being in that collegiate environment, he wasn't a natural academic. You know, being a journalist formally, he was a storyteller.
Accompanying the substantiation of archetypally motivated and monistically identified reality, where fractionalism is supplanted by polysynthetism, his work provides trenchant evidence of a concern for configurative imagistic continuity and relativity. The meaning of that is unintelligible, and so it should be.
Bill was this irreverent, non-academic person around which there was all this energy. You know, he didn't fit in terms of an academic, but yet he did in terms of the levels of his productivity, in terms of the quality of his teaching. I mean, he published more than probably most of the art historians together published.
It's such fun. I mean, this is not boring. You know, every time the word research gets attached to something, you know, it's the kiss of death. Isn't it? What it means is an academic has sucked all the juices of life out of something and then it's kicking around a dead carcass. That's research. Well, you don't think of this as research.
I think he enjoyed writing. He got a real kick out of writing, you know, and that's always a good thing if it doesn't get ahead of what photography is all about. I mean, too many people believe words about pictures are more important than pictures. And the more words you have, the greater your importance.
He wrote for a public, a mass public. He wasn't afraid of a taxi driver coming up to him and saying, I read your book or so-and-so, I disagree with this. He would love that, love that. He'd sit down in the diner then and have a long discussion about, you know, what the taxi driver thought about photography.
Well, I first met Bill, I suppose, like most other people did who knew Bill, as I met him through his writing and really fell in love with his thoughts about photography and the creative process. And when we were first starting Lenswork, he was one of the first people I contacted and said, would you like to contribute to our fledgling magazine? And he actually contributed an article to Lenswork number 4 back in 1993 when we were very first getting started. He was very supportive of the magazine. He you know, having published magazines, he knew what a challenge it was and gave me all kinds of words of encouragement and subsequently contributed a number of articles.
To me, the starting point of reading Bill J is to go onto his website. You know, it was. I suspect he was helped in it by the people at Lenswork, who were very, very, very productive with Bill, very supportive. I did a book with Bill called On Being a Photographer, I think it was called, and that was set up by them, and in fact it's actually earned me quite a lot of money because each of us put an equal amount in, so that the sort of royalties, in theory, I got from it, and Bill got from it, were quite high royalties.
Well, it's the most successful book we've ever published. It's still in publication. We still sell it. It's still as valid today as it was the day they wrote it.
I recently looked at Bill's book with David Hearn, and I think there is in that book a certain, I don't know, whether distrust of traditional academia and its relationship to photography, but you know, a belief in sort of, you know, a photographer being a working photographer, and that can be a good thing, you know. And I have subscribed to that.
If you look at Lenswork, he did this end notes thing there, which are absolutely charming, and they're witty, they're very sharp, and that's a continuation of, you know, the way he always wrote.
He said, you know, there's an idea I've had that I've carried with me, he said, for decades, and I think Lenswork would be ideal. And he described what he thought this thing could be. We didn't have a name for it then, but he basically described them as small snippets of observation that he would have that would occur to him throughout life. He would respond to a gallery announcement postcard or something he'd read somewhere or whatever. And they weren't articles, they were more little random thoughts. And he said, why don't I contribute a whole series of those? And he, matter of fact, he ended up appearing in 53 issues of Lenswork in a row, contributing 2 pages, and they are still to this day some of the favorite passages of Lenswork. People still talk about Bill's contribution through endnotes, and they're funny and they're acerbic and they're witty, and that was Bill. He was all those things.
He said one of the best things that ever happened to him was when he was working at Ilford was he had to write like 8 press releases a day, and you know, you don't sit around and play with editing. You know, you put a pencil down on a piece of paper and you write something. And he was absolutely amazing at all the things that he published. They were not highly edited, reworked and reworked and reworked. He just put it out there. It just kind of like came out of him.
You know, he used to write the same way that he spoke. He would just take out his pen and he would just write it like a sentence. And he had very few editings, very few errors, no crumpled papers on the floor. He would just sit down and write. And he might make very, very minor changes, but it just came out naturally for him.
He had incredible passion, incredible knowledge, had devotees that really loved what he said, but he was kind of ostracized, particularly when he was at university, by all the academics. I mean, the academics would love somebody that would write some paper, in my opinion, in a language which nobody else in the world speaks other than academics, speak to each other, and it would be published, in 50 copies and go in a vault and nobody would ever read it. And the fact that he would write an article for British Journal of Photography or something and go out, they kind of, what is sad is that it's almost as if they felt threatened by that. The idea of somebody having a pretty mass audience, and it wasn't that big an audience, but it was a hell of a lot bigger than people that write their thesis,
We did this little project. It wasn't like a serious project, but it was very interesting. He wanted to bring up, he would buy porn magazines and then he would shoot them up at the cabin and then photograph the pictures having full of shell, full of holes and stuff.
One critic, Ed Salsky, wrote that you cannot talk about or make photographs of the nude anymore without having a political agenda. I mean, that has the ring of authority, right? Okay? It's just absolute nonsense. And yet there's a whole generation of young photographers, and this is couched in, really good critical language, and they're all saying, oh my God, what's my political agenda when I'm photographing a nude? I really just liked her. I really think wear our clothes on. I mean, God, no, I could have a political agenda. And you force them into this corner. And of course, when anybody ever tells you what you can't do, I mean, that really makes me want to come out swinging.
Well, Bill was always making his own work. A lot of nudes, a lot of more classical themes, but the thing that really, to me, stands the test of time was his portraits of individuals in the field. He made a brilliant record.
The most important thing I think he did photographically was that he photographed virtually everybody that came to see him. And because he did it in such a casual way, it kind of has an authorship about it.
When I was very, very young, he had a friend who got cancer and died, and it was devastating. And my dad went through all of his archives and found that he only had one photograph of him, and it was a bad one.
Tony Ray Jones.
And that was why he decided that every time he saw another photographer, especially if he traveled out of town to see another photographer, or it was a chance meeting that he might not have again. Some photographers, you can go back through and see that he photographed them 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so you have sort of a longevity of this photographer. I think that a lot of that was because of Tony Ray Jones passing away before his time.
Such a pity Tony Jones picking his nose for the camera. Such a pity. Because it's not a good picture, really. For me, anyway, but choosing how you choose pictures. But it does seem to me they fall into distinct categories. One is where people are acting up. Harold Jones on the roof of his house. People pulling faces for the camera. And then others where, which are proper, serious, decently made portraits.
He made a portrait of me the morning of where I had just passed my orals for my graduate degree, and gave me a print later of it, and it was delightful that he had recorded that moment.
Trying to find here the one he made of me, and he took it at the Salford 80 event, and where I think some of the other pictures were taken because he was over on one of his visits. I was surprised when I got the book, actually, when I gave him the book, how many photographers he had actually photographed. I mean, it's one thing to know a lot of photographers and publish their work in Creative Camera. It's another thing to actually make some interesting photographs of them, which obviously he did. And there's no particular sort of style. Every picture is different. I mean, photographically, some are more interesting than others because he had more opportunities to do things. But I think he also had a mission, not only to make photography better known to the public and within the culture, but also to keep a record of the people he met during his journey.
I wasn't trying hard to be a photographer, but was doing what David had always advocated, which is aiming my camera at the things that interested me as a sort of visual journal. So I started photographing the photographers that passed through my life as a magazine editor initially, and then as a lecturer and teacher and so on. That these were not intended for publication or exhibition. I wasn't looking for any commercial assignments or photojournalistic jobs. Suddenly, photography was a visual game again. It became fun, to photograph the people that I met.
It's a step above a snapshot. It's a snapshot by somebody who's seen a lot of photographs and therefore has a sense that photographs need design or geometry, etc. So, I remember him saying that at one time he was editing and he had 600, and I've heard later that he had maybe 1,000. I think that's probably a very important grouping of photographs.
And then later I didn't know that Bill had got really quite ill, because David used to go over to America every summer, I think, or every couple of summers. And I knew that Bill had been quite ill, been bitten by a snake. There was always these sort of little rumours about Bill, like most of us just get ill and die, and Bill had been bitten by a snake. It was so, it was so biblical, like the asp. The snake from the Garden of Eden had finally got its own back.
He was bitten by a rattlesnake up at his cabin. He had a cabin about an hour and a half north of the University of Phoenix, up in the Ponderosa Pines. And his daughter, Hannah, was coming up for the weekend. He saw this large rattlesnake crawl under his cabin. His cabin was up on stilts, so it was elevated. And he thought, no way having her come up and this snake is going to be around. So he went after the snake, and the only thing he grabbed was a spatula off his barbecue. So he's fighting this rattlesnake with a spatula that's this long. And the rattlesnake bites him and strikes him. And he became quite ill. They measure, sometimes rattlesnakes do a dry strike, and they will bite you but not inject venom. And they once you're taken to a facility, they measure the distance of expansion between the bite marks to see if there's venom there or not. And it was too long until he got to the hospital and it was no longer expanding. So they said, we think it's a dry strike. Go home and you'll be fine. And even if they did give him the anti-venom, that can be as serious as getting the venom in the first place. So after that period for 6 to 9 months, he was not well. He would lose his train of thought. It's a poison toxin to your central nervous system. And he would be lecturing and in the middle of a sentence forget where he was. You would just touch him and his skin would go brilliant red over his entire body. You just touch his finger and in 2 seconds his face was brilliant red. So he had definitely gotten this toxin into his system, which some doctors later claim may have contributed to his later heart attacks.
He had an episode where he had a heart attack, and what they had discovered was that he had most likely had several. And so by the time he was diagnosed with congestive heart failure, he had about 25% of his heart left in function, and which meant that he was not allowed to go back to school to teach. He had to cut out everything and basically retire, and he wasn't given a choice. He was given they said, if you'll be fortunate if you live out the year.
So when Bill fell ill, and we'd gotten the word that he'd had a series of medical incidents and a series of heart attacks, I got a phone call from ASU. I was living down in Tucson at the time, asking if I could come up and teach Bill's graduate seminar that fall, because he wasn't going to come back, at least that fall. So I drove up every week, and Bill and I would communicate, of course, closely on that class. We would go to his backyard with many of the classes, and I was really honored that he asked me to step in for him.
What people probably don't know, I didn't know even until he had this, is that Phoenix, Arizona, is at a very high altitude. You somehow think of the desert, must be very low, but it's very, and therefore the air is thin there, and he needed to be in a place that's very good, and so that's why he moved from Phoenix to San Diego.
At that point, he began traveling to San Diego and found that he was feeling much better, could breathe more easily. The ocean, moist air, and sea level agreed with him.
He was by the sea. And it was very good for him, and he lasted a long time there. When he was there, he wanted to continue doing what he could do as well as he could do it, and the only real thing he could do was to meet photographers, an enormous amount of photographers. I mean, this is, I can't think of many sort of writers nowadays that attract photographers from all over the world to come and talk to them. Bill did that. I mean, if you went to stay with Bill, there was, I would say at least once a fortnight, somebody came to see him specifically, of some eminence in photography.
It was just great to see him. He was in good shape, apart from the fact that he was quite ill, because he was smoking away and he has a very weak heart. So this is something that we often have spoken about as being a potential problem, and I guess in the end it's the thing that got him.
He loved to help people, so enormous amount of people San Diego is a very nice place. It's by the beach. It's amazing how many people would sort of say, "Oh, I'd love to come and stay with you, Bill," and then they would come and stay with Bill, and they didn't realize that Bill actually had physically roughly an hour in the morning and an hour in the afternoon that he could function. The rest of the time, he was exhausted.
He was very intuitive about his, his energy level. He had windows where he felt well, and he was on a lot of medication. And so he was always an early riser. So he got up at 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, worked, and then he would have lunch and a nap. And then that was it. I mean, he was sort of done for the rest of the day.
I've always made photographs, but usually I've made photographs over long periods of time, extended projects. I've been photographing, for example, as you know, portraits of photographers since the late 1960s, which I still continue. Other long projects, I spent 10 years photographing people with their camera at beauty spots. But after my retirement, I found I encountered a problem. That because of physical limitations, I couldn't walk very far, couldn't travel very much, and so I had to find a project that was close to home.
There was a lot of people that were older and with white hair and beards. So I told him that I know why you like it here so much. You are surrounded by people who look like you.
One weekend, my youngest daughter, Hannah, and I were sitting in a cafe, and she was looking around and saying, "Dad, I know why you like to live here. There are a lot of old geezers here who look just like you." Thanks, Hannah. That's my project. I'm going to photograph people who look like me. But gradually, the project focused itself very naturally. I always took the dog out for a walk at dawn, and I would wander up and down the alleys and byways of this little community, and all of them end up at the sea. So I'd walk along the seafront and then back up the alleys. And about dawn is when a lot of homeless men start to emerge from behind dumpsters, you know, from hedgerows and wherever they could find a quiet, relatively warm place to sleep. And so I would just be in conversation with them, and I got to know some of them very well. And so this became the more specific focus of the project. And then I thought, well, I was photographing them, I should also photograph the alleyways, you know, in which we held most of our conversations. These men seem to be much more like me than just their physical appearance.
He would walk around San Diego and he would chat with the homeless people and became friends with them. Often, you know, he'd give them money for a bath or a night in a hotel. He got to know them, and whenever he photographed these men, he would give them a photograph of themselves. He never wanted to take advantage of anybody. One of the really nice things, though, was that at one point when he ran into one of the homeless men, he said, "Come and see what we did." And they had transformed a garage into sort of a bunk room, a co-ed bunk room. And they had all gotten together and lined the wall of it with all of the photographs that he had taken over all of them. So it was sort of a quick impromptu gallery visit, and it was really one of his favorites. He liked
was
that
really
the most.
touched. He was really touched by that.
That was his favorite.
I was feeling old and decrepit. You know, I was feeling when I saw these men on my morning walks, there but for the grace of God go I. I've known what it is to be poor and hungry. There have been lots of times in my youth and 20s, you know, where I had no means of buying food or paying the rent. And so I've known the shame of standing in doll lines, as they say in England, and luckily I've never been interested in drinking alcohol, you know, so I've been very lucky.
We kept in touch, you know, postcards and odd, you know, letters and so on over the years. And then the last time I saw him was in, I think, 2005 at the Creative Camera Conference at the National Museum of Photography in Bradford.
I remember he was asked to do a talk in I think it was Bradford or somewhere like that. You know, he wrote this thing, you know, about you know, the history of photography in England, an album, etc., etc. And what he had asked is that the papers on it were distributed, and he was going to give a different talk, and suddenly when he got there, they hadn't been distributed, and they hadn't been distributed because, in a way, what it was saying is that, hang on, all you people that are now talking about it were not the forerunners. Photography of this, the way it was discussed in a new way, did not start in 72. It actually started probably in 68, you know.
so thrilled when Bill was to be given the Infinity Award for writing. And he hadn't been to New York in years. He'd really not traveled much at all later in life. And he decided he was going to come. It was very exciting. Darius and I, of course, had been collaborating for years on our books. And so we knew that we wanted to be here, honor Bill. And spent the day with him. That day, went together to the event. Martin was there, Martin Parr, and many people that he'd known for years but hadn't seen in a long time. So Bill's acceptance speech talked about how thrilled he was and appreciative. It really was the only honor that he'd gotten. And he spent time during that speech to say that that platform gave him the opportunity to talk about how important his teaching was to him. Get choked up. It's okay. And he talked about how, as a teacher, you can only hope that your students go far beyond you in their own gifts back to the field. So he spoke about how he was honored by the work of his students, and he was thrilled that several were there that night. And then he turned the corner and said that he was there really to say goodbye, that in 6 months' time, or perhaps it was 6 weeks, I have the transcript, I should have fact-checked, but that he was soon to leave the country, and that his 50 years of writing was done, and it really took the audience by surprise.
He wrapped up all of his affairs, and he sold all of his books that he had collected since before any of us were born. He sold all of his photographs. He said, "You're not going to know what to do with these, and so I will handle it for you." So he let go of everything. In fact, when he went to Costa Rica, he probably brought a coffee cup, his Infinity Award, some photographs, his favorite books. He loved Colin Wilson. He loved to read, avid reader. And he was really excited about the next adventure, and he knew that this was going to be his big last adventure.
So he went to Costa Rica with his friend Rich, found this beautiful little village in a bay, off of a bay in Guanacaste, and he went down a little road and found a house for sale, and he bought it spontaneously. And so, without really intentionally deciding, I'm going to move to Costa Rica, he just found a place that he loved. He bought it and invited us down, and we all got to spend some time with him. He loved, the scenery was beautiful. He felt good, by the sea air. He was swimming every day. Nobody asked him what he did for a living, and there were no photographers there.
Happy as a free man driving on without a care in this world. The rumor is they love you, but money can buy back your soul. Shorten the mile. No fruit up in the orchard and turn my hand. I ain't going down that beat-on path.
After Bill died, we knew his ashes, he wanted to be made into a photograph. So some of his ashes went to Jim.
It was, from that moment on, probably one of the strangest weeks of my life. I became desperately ill. I ended up with some kind of viral infection, but I think it was 90% empathy. And It took me a week to grind the ashes into a fine powder, prepare the paper, and then do an edition of prints, which resulted in 10 gum bichromate prints.
Take me from the boardwalk, I feel like going home. Write it on a postcard, nowhere I belong, nowhere I belong.
We also knew that he wanted to come home and to be scattered in the Thames the same as her parents, and that's what happened. The year after he died, his daughters came over and we went down the river and his ashes were scattered in the Thames.
Revelations mark these wiry veins, wisdom lies beyond all the haze. Take me from the boardwalk, I feel like...
Well, I think his influence on British photography is pretty important. You know, he was, he brought that enthusiasm, that direction, that application.
I think he was very influential on everybody because, I mean, he was going around saying all his stuff, that all this was important.
It's rare to meet people whose enthusiasm isn't something that they switch on and off. It's, you know, ran through deep into the bone marrow.
All of us have Bill sort of fused into us in the way that he taught us. And it was never a straight line. It was a rich and tangled web.
I think his career, you know, as an editor, as a photographer, as a teacher, as a writer on photography, was a reflection of his personality.
Above all, I think what he did was that he enthused other people to love photography, you know, in a way that I've never met in anybody else.
An impressive movie, as I'm sure you'll agree.
1, 2, 3, 4.
There's a sequel to this story, which is that just a few years ago, after a gap of 30-odd years, I happened to come across, tucked in the back of my office cupboard, the box of prints that I had shown David Hearn way back in 1967 or whenever it was. And I looked through them and I said, you know, David, he's wrong. These are pretty good pictures after all this time.